Hello, everyone. I'd like to, first of all, thank the organizers of this first Congresso Paraguaio de Linguística Aplicada for this opportunity and for their efforts managing this conference entirely online. I'd also like to thank the participants, all of you, for your attention. I'm Clarissa. I'm speaking from Brazil, where I was born and work as a university professor in the areas of applied linguistics and language education. I work at higher education, both as a professor and a research supervisor at postgraduate levels. And I decided to talk to you today about decoloniality and how important it is, how significant it is, how way more than just another buzzword, the processes of decoloniality and all the discussion around decoloniality can be. So, let me just um, rearrange the screen here. Okay, better like this. So I will start then from the assumption that formal language teaching and learning has been structured around, or has been actually designed and implemented as as a colonial endeavor, as a project of modernity, and therefore it has been and it is up to today immersed in coloniality. So this means that language teacher education, the way I see it, needs a decolonial option to be more inclusive and more significant to a diverse society like ours. For me, one way to promote such decolonial option is through problematizing the role of language in society and in education, both formal and informal education. So this, I believe, can be made through the perspective of epistemophagy, which is a local term I coined that refers to the local appropriation of knowledges, and through epistemophagy, then to rethink the constructs of norm, proficiency, and intelligibility, for example, as well as that of the native speaker, adopting a translingual orientation to language. So from such conceptualization of language, then I look at the potentiality of language education to be highly beneficial to a more inclusive, more horizontal, less prejudiced social design. So language teacher education, for that purpose, I think, can be productively thought of as a process of cultural translation, which I will explain in the third part of this presentation. So this is in a nutshell what I invite you to think about in the next 20 minutes or so. So here we go. So let's start from the understanding of coloniality as advanced by the Brazilian scholar Menezes de Souza, who corroborates the modernity coloniality Latin American group and defined coloniality not as the historical process of colonization, but as the unequal relation of power, knowledge, races, resources, controlled and reproduced in the name of development. So colonization for him defines which knowledges are valued as knowledge, and it establishes who is recognized as a full citizen and who is not. And this is also the view of the Argentinian Walter Mignolo, for whom coloniality, in his own words, is the darker side of the European narrative known as modernity. This is also to say, again, in Mignolo's words, that coloniality is constitutive of modernity, that there is no modernity without coloniality. And he insists on this very, very often. So often I memorized his own words. So from such perspective, then, I think we can frame language teacher education, especially in Brazil, as highly problematic insofar as it is a colonial project. It is a colonial project in the sense that it reproduces Eurocentric assumptions about science, knowledge, and the subjects who know, privileging homogeneity of practices, measurable outcomes, rationality, linearity, homogeneity, for example. So as such, it is a violent project both to local epistemologies, local ways of knowing, and ontologies, local ways of conceiving of beings and of knowledges. So I like to look at epistemologies and ontologies as being always together. So such violence, I think, has to do with what Sousa Santos called the abyssal line, which would be an imaginary line dividing north and south, and of course downplaying to the point of invisibility everything in the south. North and south here are not seen as geographical positions per se, though they very often coincide with geography, but they are seen mainly as a metaphor, both the line in north and south, as metaphors for an onto-epistemological divide that projects negative features and values as being characteristic from the south. So values and features such as injustice, poverty, ignorance, etc., are always related to the South and projects positive features as being northern or coming from the north. So it is very clear to me that we, especially us in the global South, do need to erase this abyssal line. And I think that one way to move in this direction is for us to delink our concept of language from the monolingual orientation that has developed language teaching and learning theories based on an idealized monolingual speaker model that is very far from what we observe when we are in our classrooms teaching a foreign language, for example. So this idealization of monolingualism has led to constructs such as those of the native speaker, mother tongue, and language ownership, for example. And these are constructs that project us, the non-native speakers from the South, as illegitimate language users who will never attain the desired proficiency, because this proficiency is that of the so-called native speaker that we will never be of the foreign languages we want to learn. So this has created a habitus that has been both imposed on us by social and cultural beliefs, but has also been self-inflicted, as we are all creatures of modernity, and this modernity constitutes us, as I mentioned before. So in order to at least diminish the violence of these constructs, I think we need to implement some sort of decolonial project to education in general and to language education more specifically. So according to these two Brazilian educators, Oliveira and Candal, a decolonial project proposes an epistemic turn that is able to produce new knowledges and another symbolic understanding of the world without losing sight of the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. Interculturality, which I prefer to think in terms of cultural translation, as we'll see at the end of the presentation. So interculturality conceived in this perspective represents the construction of a new epistemological space that includes subaltern and Eastern knowledges in a tense, critical, and more egalitarian relation. So as far as applied linguistics and language teaching and learning is concerned, this, I think, can be translated as having, instead of a monolingual orientation, a translingual orientation to language. And this calls for a resignification of language. So translingualism sees languages as always in contact and mutually influencing one another. And it also sees proficiency in one language as informing proficiency in another language, and not as two separate skills or abilities. Not skills, sorry, abilities. So in fact, the idea of repertoire and not language is preferred here when we talk about translingualism. Meaning in translingualism is seen as produced in reading the word and the world together, as Freire and Macedo have put it. So meaning, this is to say that meaning is produced in concrete situations of enunciation, in specific interactions, and it is always negotiated in the contexts where language happens. It's always imbued in social, historical, and political dimensions. So languages here are seen as constituted by modality, always in relation to other modes of communication besides the verbal, And that makes texts and meanings, of course, always multimodal and diverse, never purely verbal. Our senses always contribute to what a text can do, to what language does. So also, again, inspired by Bakhtin's work, in a translingual orientation, the borders between languages are also constructs, and languages are characterized as heteroglossic, meaning that they exist in a multiplicity of social voices within a huge variety of dialogical relations. So they are plural, multiple, filled with many voices. All this amounts also to the idea that nobody owns a language, as languages are not objects, they are not things out there. They exist in performativity. Languages are something we do, they are not objects we possess. So this dislocates the centrality of the so-called native speakers as the proprietors of their languages. Right? It's a completely different view of language. Oops. Yeah, right. So what I think this translingual orientation informed by decoloniality does is that it sort of digests the modernity of our traditional language theories pretty much in the fashion presented by the Brazilian modernists. And these were artists that in the 20s, in the 1920s, called anthropophagy the way they appropriated European influences to produce local art. They used digestion as a metaphor, which I think fits what decoloniality proposes. Not to do away with the coloniality that constitutes us, but to reinvent it, to nourish from the good aspects of it, and to eliminate in a digestive process what is toxic. I must say, though, that I myself am, in a way, epistemophagying the concept of anthropophagy as activated by the modernists, and I'm using it with an F, even in English. So this is not a mistake. I'm referring to epistemophagy also. In epistemophagy, I'm referring also to troubled digestive processes, processes that are populated by cramps, contortions, pain, conflict. So it's ambivalent character that I want to call attention here. Digestion being both good, nourishing, and comforting, but also with the potentiality of being bad, intoxicating in a negative sense, and uncomfortable. So, a decolonial project, according to Menezes de Souza, needs to undergo three movements: identify, interrogate, and interrupt coloniality. So my decolonial project, being a teacher of English in Brazil, my onto-epistemological turn has been to tackle the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being in the domain of language studies. What I have been making by problematizing some of the colonial constructs in language acquisition and teaching and learning theories that relate to or even derive from the native speaker construct. That is, for example, the notions of intelligibility, proficiency, and norm, which I will briefly mention here. So, to decolonize intelligibility, I have been promoting the need to look at intelligibility as something contextually given or determined. That is, as defined, as something defined in local practices, specific to each situation in which we do language, and also as focusing more on how we employ language, how we use language among the disempowered, how language is done among the disempowered, or among non-native speakers of English, for example. So this means to look into our language practices as motivated by meaning making rather than by emulating idealized native speakers. To show you possible moves to decolonize then the idea of norm and normativity, I brought intentionally two quotes from the center, from the north, from very English scholars researching English as a lingua franca, and who have been promoting such effort as well. So the first one is by Widowson, who back in 2003 wrote that norm is not simply a means of communication, but the symbolic possession of a particular community expressive of its identity, its conventions and values. So to undermine standard English is to undermine what it stands for, the security of this community and its institutions. And that is why he thinks it is so difficult to do away with the idea that we need the norm to communicate. So the other quote is by Jennifer Jenkins, and here she's also, she's also very English. So here she explores the effects of this undermining of the norm, the effects that this brings to the constructions of the so-called native speakers and the constructions that they produce for themselves and their identities, how they see who they are. So she writes, letting the language go involves letting control, power, and authority go as well. But it involves even more than that. It means having to construct identity in different fashion. So this affects greatly how we see the concept of proficiency, which from a decolonial perspective, then, we need to question who decides if somebody is or is not proficiency, based on which frame of reference and why. What are our motivations? We need to delink the idea of proficiency from place of birth and look at native and non-native language teachers as being more or less competent at their job on the basis of their ability to do and promote cultural translation, to teach and to produce, or to teach to produce and to produce meanings in intercultural translation, rather than stigmatize the alleged non-native speaker teachers as if they were counterfeit teachers, as some sort of interlanguage limbo users of English, or illegitimate practitioners as teachers. So what do I mean by cultural translation? So this is another move in my decolonial project, which is to go from a worldview based on the need for someone supposedly more knowledgeable because better educated than me, to explain the world to me, the world as it really is, as if I needed someone to represent this world to me so I could inhabit it. So what I am presenting here instead is that we move away from this view of colonial transmission and assimilation and move towards a different worldview that sees our relationality with the world and with other people as a process of translation that is always incomplete, never fixed, always open to difference, towards it is a move towards a more horizontal world that I like to call a world of decolonial meaning making, that I think also could be metaphorically depicted by these two hands, by this image, by these two images by Escher, the one of the two hands, one writing collaboratively, drawing one another, but also by that drawing of the stairs that go up or down depending on how we look at them, and therefore go both up and down at the same time, referring to the instability and impossibility of fixing subjectivities and meanings that I see in the process of cultural translation. So what happens in language teacher education as cultural translation then is that it is redefined in terms, in the same terms or in similar terms that language has been redefined in translanguaging. So being a teacher of English, for example, within the perspective of cultural translation becomes a performative and localized practice of dislocating the purported stability of meanings and challenging the idea that meanings can be transposed literally from one language to another. So here, a language teacher needs to create contact zones, as in Mary Louise Pratt's suggestion of the term contact zones as a substitute for the neatness of the term communities. So in cultural translation, a language teacher is someone who sees themselves as living in a rhizomatic world and creating spaces for dialogical encounters with difference. even in what is usually perceived as a single culture. As cultures are never homogeneous, right? So this means that our practice as language teachers is one of PRAXItioners. That's my new word, referring to Freire's concept of praxis as theory and practice being always together. So PRAXItioners, thinking of our identities and the languages we teach as performative spaces that characterize us as decolonial cultural translators, teachers that work in situated processes of language teaching that digest the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being that has constituted constructs such as proficiency, norm, and intelligibility. So my struggles have involved the practice of trying to horizontalize my course plans and collaboratively design my criteria and instruments of evaluation together with each group of students, having them contribute as much as possible to my teaching processes, and also, of course, exposing them to linguistic and cultural diversity, not only among different languages and different and how they are used in different countries, but also within this language we call English, as if it were a single language. So this decolonial endeavor, even if even if clearly not enough to revolutionize the university and language teaching, it has helped to keep me alive and kicking, sometimes too hard. So in this sense, I'd like to share with you one last quote, this time by Freire, in which he says that in a country such as Brazil, to keep hope alive is in itself a revolutionary act. So I feel like a revolutionary lately, especially lately. So thank you very much for your attention. So here's the link for my references and the QR code, if you prefer. And gracias por su atención. And hope we can debate some of these concepts, and I can have the opportunity to perhaps clarify or change my perspective from the interaction we're about to have. Okay, so let me just stop sharing my screen, and yes, that's it. Thank you.